Good evening, everyone. Welcome to True Diversity Film Series, Standing in Solidarity. My name is Donna Walker-Kuhn. My pronouns are she, her, and I'm Senior Advisor of Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion here at New Jersey Performing Arts Center. This evening, our discussion is titled Women's Reproductive Rights, and we will explore the impact of the Roe v. Wade decision on numerous platforms by a panel of thought leaders assembled by our partners, ACLU, New Jersey. I also hope you were able to watch the film, Supreme Revenge, Battle for the Court. That was provided in the registration link. This social justice series is part of our Standing in Solidarity initiative. The purpose of this series is to bring our communities together, to encourage everyone to take part in the movement to ensure civil rights for all. On our website, you can find archived prior social justice panel discussions, as well as resources that will help you take action. We're also very happy to have as our advisors our Newark NAACP, New Jersey Institute for Social Justice, Newark Arts, the Truth, Racial Healing and Transformation Center at Rutgers University, Newark, Africana Institute at Essex County College, and ACLU, New Jersey. Now, NJPAC would like to offer a land acknowledgement. The language we're using was created with consultation and guidance from Chief Dwayne Perry of the Ramapo Lenape Munsee tribe and Oleana Whispering Dove of the Eastern Salagi Algonquin descendants. And we're grateful to both of them for their generosity, wisdom, and labor to craft these words. We, the Lenape, original benefactors of land once ripened and cultivated with attentiveness to the Creator and her ascendancy, express everlasting gratitude to our Creator for the traditional ancestral jurisdictions of the Munsee, Esopus, Canarsie, Capsee, Werpois, Siwanoy, and Weekasquee, jointly known today as the Ramapo and Nanticoke Lene Lenape. We are the Lenape Hoking today and will be for the remaining days of tomorrow, keepers of the past. Let this moment of recognition be a monument of action. Let it be the beginning of hope for this, our Turtle Island, and for the Ramapo Lenape, the Munsee people of whose land we now trod. Here on this land, in this place of the Munsee, we acknowledge our debt to those who have come before us, to those who have been denigrated and suffered for the sake of cultural and land appropriation. Let this, our land acknowledgement, be the beginning of our return to unity. Let us be guardians of the water, the air, and the earth, the four-legged, the flyers, the swimmers, the crawlers, the mammal people, and the green. Let us now stand lifting our humanity, enrapturing with Earth's consciousness as guardians of harmony and kindness. So this acknowledgement demonstrates NJPAC's ongoing commitment as a community working to dismantle the continued legacies of colonialism, oppression, and systemic racism. We thank you. We also would like to thank our corporate sponsors for Standing in Solidarity, that's PSEG. They have consistently provided resources to enable us to produce this important work. It is now my great pleasure to introduce our moderator for the evening, Amal Sinha, Executive Director of ACLU New Jersey. Amal is no stranger to NJPAC's True Diversity Film Series, Standing in Solidarity. He supported and curated quite a number of our panel discussions. Amal is a nationally recognized civil rights leader who has dedicated his career to advancing racial justice, holding institutions accountable, and promoting and defending rights and liberties. As Executive Director of the ACLU of New Jersey, Amal leads a team of dedicated professionals and guides the organization's innovative, integrated advocacy work, utilizing litigation, policy, public education, strategic communications to build a more equitable society. Amal is also actively involved in the South Asian American community, including having served as the president of the South Asian Bar Association of New York, where he led efforts to shape the organization's public interest community and programming. Amal, welcome, and thank you so much for all you do for us at NJPAC. We truly appreciate everything. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Donna. It's truly an honor to work with you again, and to all my colleagues at NJPAC, thank you so much for having us and for having this very important conversation. So as Donna mentioned, my name is Amol Sinha. I'm the Executive Director of the ACLU of New Jersey. I use he, him pronouns. So before we get started with our esteemed panel, which I'll introduce in a sec, I wanted to take a minute to talk about the context of this conversation and what we are actually talking about in the times that we're living in. So as most folks probably know, for almost 50 years, 49 years, Roe versus Wade was the law of the land. And Roe versus Wade held that abortion is a constitutional right protected by the US Constitution, and that no state could prevent or prohibit somebody from seeking an abortion. In 49 years later, we now have a decision from the Supreme Court from this past June, the last week of June, in Dobbs versus Jackson Women's Health Organization, which overturned Roe versus Wade and now said that it's up to the states to decide the extent to which abortion can be legal in those jurisdictions. Immediately after Dobbs, there was a vast rash of states that decided that they would either limit or prevent people from seeking an abortion, in some cases to the point of almost criminalizing abortion or seeking an abortion. And that has had detrimental impact on a number of different communities, but particularly the most marginalized among us. And that includes people who are economically disadvantaged. And since in this country, economic status is inextricably intertwined with race, we know that the burden is going to be disproportionately felt by Black and Brown communities in the United States. And so this conversation emerges in that context, that we're seeing for the first time in our history, the Supreme Court overturned precedent to take away a right that it had previously granted, and then having a ripple effect across the country that, of course, touches our communities in New Jersey and beyond. And so with that, I want to talk about how we're going to have this conversation. So we're going to touch on a number of different issue areas and a number of different perspectives. Thankfully, our esteemed panelists carry a depth and breadth of expertise, and we're going to talk about how we got here, what we're dealing with now, and what we hope to see in the future. We're going to touch on this from a historical perspective, from a legal and policy perspective, from a medical perspective, and from just a cultural and societal perspective as well. So with that, I would love for us to introduce our panelists for this evening. I want to start with introducing Kim Mutcherson, who is the co-dean of Rutgers Law School and a reproductive justice scholar. And with each panelist, I would love for you to introduce yourself in 30 to 60 seconds if you can, and just share a little bit about yourself and your work and what you bring to this conversation.
Sure. So I'll say really quickly, because I think it's important, that I describe myself as a reproductive justice scholar, not a reproductive rights scholar. And for those of you who aren't familiar with the term, reproductive justice is a much more expansive and fulsome, frankly, movement that was started by Black women in the mid-90s. And there are three central tenets, right? That everybody has a right to decide if they want to become pregnant. Everybody has a right to decide if they want to terminate a pregnancy, and everybody has a right to raise their children in safe and healthy environments. So I like to put that on the table, because any conversation that I have about abortion is never just about abortion. It's about all of these ways in which reproduction and parenting are impacted by the law, but also impacted by so many socioeconomic factors in our country.
Thanks so much, Kim. Next, we have Joshua Prager, who is a writer and the author of The Family Roe, which looked at the history of Roe versus Wade.
Thank you so much. So yes, I'm a journalist and I have a real interest in history, humanizing history. And I often focus on sort of the missing pieces of history, the unknowns. And what drew me to the story of Roe v. Wade and the history of abortion in America was the realization that Norma McCorvey, the plaintiff known as Jane Roe, had not been able to have the abortion she sought, the abortion she won the legal right to have, because the case took too long. So she had a child known as the Roe baby, an anonymous human being who was then placed for adoption. I wanted to find that person. I eventually did. And in the course of writing about her, I spent a decade on this issue, really sort of bringing to light the unknown people behind it, and also examining the larger issue of abortion in America. I am pro-choice, but I'm not an advocate. And I tried my best to sort of understand really both sides of this issue, understand how it is that abortion came to be so fraught in this country. And it was actually very gratifying to me and surprising to me that people on both sides of the issue did sort of embrace my approach to this subject.
Thanks, Josh. Next, we have Jackie Cornell, who is the Executive Director of the Planned Parenthood Action Fund of New Jersey.
Hi, good evening, everybody. I'm Jackie Cornell. I use she, her pronouns. I'm delighted to be with you tonight to talk about this important issue. As Amal mentioned, I'm the Executive Director of Planned Parenthood Action Fund of New Jersey. We represent the political work that represents the two affiliates of Planned Parenthood. Together, those affiliates operate 21 health centers here in New Jersey and see over 100,000 lives every year. And I'm really excited to have this conversation, both from the landscape of what is going on in our health centers every day, as well as what my colleagues around the country are working on and fighting for. My background is in government, and so I often lean back on those experiences serving in both state and federal government, thinking about how the decisions that impact everyday people and how the power and the structure within government can make those decisions either easier or harder, more complicated or less, more hurdles or less. And so that lens, I think, brings a really important piece to this work, thinking about how do we get government to do the right thing or encourage them to do the right thing when we're talking about healthcare access, as I think a lot of tonight's conversation will be anchored around here. So thanks again for having me and excited for the conversation.
Thanks, Jackie. And last and certainly but not least, we have Dr. Simone Manigault. Dr. Simone Manigault, who is a pediatrician with a specific focus on adolescent.
Hi, I'm Simone Manigault. I am a physician trained in pediatrics with specialty in adolescent medicine. A lot of people don't know that adolescent medicine exists as a subspecialty. I like to call our subspecialties the specialty of sex, drugs, and rock and roll. And almost every specialist that you come across has their own area of interest. And my area of interest is sexuality and helping young people as they have their sexual debuts and having their rights, and to decrease the barriers to care when it comes to their reproductive health. We are all trained to approach our patients in a non-judgmental way in all kinds of ways. So I'm excited to be part of this conversation.
Thanks so much, Simone. All right, let's dive right in. So I'm going to ask a couple of questions and we'll just have as free-flowing of a conversation as possible. And of course, if folks who are participating in the conversation have any questions, please feel free to use the Q&A feature or to put it in the chat. And we'll try to incorporate those questions to the panel and then have some Q&A towards the end as well. My first question is going to be for Josh. We sometimes think about Supreme Court precedent as these like standalone moments, right? Roe v. Wade, Brown versus Board, Loving versus Virginia. We think about these precedents as having existed for time immemorial, and we don't really often think about what led to those moments and how we got there, and the human faces and the human impact of the decisions. So you've written extensively about the history of Roe v. Wade and abortion rights in the U.S. How did we get to a place where Roe, which protected the right to an abortion under our Constitution, became the law of the land? So
Roe was filed by two lawyers in Texas in 1970. They were representing Jane Roe, an anonymous plaintiff. Her real name was Norma McCorvey. She was a really sort of poor woman who was working as a waitress in a gay bar at the time, and it was her third sort of unwanted pregnancy, and she did not want to go through with it. The lawyers asserted that there was a constitutional right to abortion that was rooted in privacy, and that a right to privacy was guaranteed by the 14th Amendment. They needed precedent, just like you said, and so as to argue to the court that there was legal precedent for this right to abortion, they pointed to a 1965 case called Griswold versus Connecticut, which argued that that a state ban on the use of contraception violated a right to privacy. The court had agreed and overturned that ban, and they were going to say, hey, we too see that a right to privacy guarantees a right to abortion. At the time that the lawyers were preparing this case in late 1969, abortion was legal in just two states in this country, Oregon and California. It was also not explicitly illegal in DC, but over the coming months in 1970, as they readied their case, 4 more states legalized abortion: Alaska, Hawaii, New York, and Washington. It's worth noting that advocates, people who believed in a right to abortion, were divided on whether to file suit or whether to let the issue play out state by state. Some suggested, including the future Justice Ginsburg, that they ought to leave it alone regardless and just let it play out and gain a momentum. That was debated whether that would have happened or not. The case proceeded, and in 1973, the Supreme Court ruled 7-2 that a woman had a legal right to abortion until the point of viability, roughly at the end of the second trimester. I'll add 2 quick points that I think it's helpful to keep in mind as we have this conversation. The first is that up until that point, abortion was not, in 1973, a political or partisan issue. Quite the opposite. One of those 4 states I mentioned, California, it was Governor Ronald Reagan that signed into law this very liberal law at that point, which guaranteed a right to abortion up until the 20th week for non-residents too. And that law had broad bipartisan support. Most of the country accepted the Roe ruling. The Wall Street Journal editorial page wrote, and I'm quoting, that it struck a reasonable balance on an exceedingly difficult question. And most amazingly, the first justice who was sort of appointed to the court after Roe, John Paul Stevens, was not even asked his opinion of Roe at his Senate confirmation hearing. The second thing I think that's important to keep in mind is that if abortion was not yet political, it was, as it is today, an issue defined by class. The plaintiff, Norma McCorvey, really is case in point. As I mentioned, she was poor, and she found an illegal but safe abortion clinic in Texas where she could have an abortion, but she could not afford the $500, and she could not afford to fly, for example, to California where it was legal. Meantime, her lawyer, Sarah Weddington, who was from an upper middle class family in Texas, she was able to afford abortion, and she had had one during law school. Interestingly, she did not tell her client about that, and she did not help her to have an abortion because she was, of course, more valuable to her as a plaintiff so as to move forward with Roe. And so again, just to put a final bow on it, then as now, class in many ways dictated whether a woman had access to safe legal abortion.
Wow, thank you for that summary, Josh. You know, as you pointed out, there were many years of case law and other sorts of attempts to get to Roe. And just as Roe took some time to get to as a decision, we now have Dobbs, right, which overturned Roe. And it's not as though that happened overnight. And so I want to pull in our friend Kim Mutcherson here to ask you this question. You know, clearly, for nearly 50 years, people who were anti-abortion were trying to overturn Roe versus Wade for decades, and were ultimately successful with the ruling in Dobbs. As a reproductive justice scholar, can you share your thoughts on what led to that moment and share a bit about what the Dobbs decision did and didn't do?
Yeah, absolutely. Well, I think one of the things that I want to say first is to parrot something that Josh said already, which is that this became such a political issue, which meant that it became a voting issue, right? And if you could get people to vote on it, then you could win. And that I think is a really important piece that we have here. And I would say there was this sort of very impressive multi-decade campaign that was targeting Roe versus Wade. It really became sort of, a real kind of rallying cry. And there were lots and lots of pieces to it. But I think two of the things that we need to really think about, one, a really good understanding of how important judges are in this context, right? So state court judges, as well as federal court judges, and then also how important voter suppression is, right? And we don't think of those things necessarily as being reproductive rights issues, and yet both of those things were incredibly important to getting us to a point where we no longer have a constitutional right to abortion. And so over those years, after 1973, we saw, various moments of chipping away, more cases, right? We got 1992 Planned Parenthood versus Casey, where the court threw away the trimester framework from Roe and said, now we're just going to focus on viability, and then kept moving until we were at a point where we were getting literally hundreds of pieces of legislation in states every year that were targeting access to abortion. And then what we got was a series of Supreme Court justices that came quite quickly, frankly. So Justice Gorsuch, Justice Kavanaugh, and then, the nail in the coffin, Justice Barrett, who obviously took over the seat of Justice Ruth Bader Ginsburg. And the last thing that I'll say about this shift is that as late as 2020, the Supreme Court issued an opinion in June Medical Services reiterating that there is a constitutional right to an abortion. The only thing that changed between that decision in June 2020 and the decision in June 22 is the justices who sat on the court, right? So the politics of that are obviously really problematic. And so the consequence is exactly what anybody who does this work at all would have imagined would happen, right? So take away the federal right to an abortion, throw it back to the states. It's sort of laughable that the Supreme Court sort of suggested we're going to get out of the business of abortion now, and we're just going to let it play itself out in the states. And the joke I've been making, which actually isn't very funny because it's sort of painful, is that really the only winners in this are lawyers, right? Because there's this litigation everywhere. There are so many issues that have to be sorted out, right? So Roe, for instance, said that you had to have an exception for the life and health of the pregnant woman. Does that still exist? Is that still a rule? Do you still have to have a judicial bypass in place if you have a parental consent law? Planned Parenthood versus Casey, the court told us you couldn't require spousal notification. Maybe you can now, right? So there's this whole host of issues that are going to have to be sorted out, and they're going to be sorted out not by one federal court, right? The US Supreme Court saying, here's the rule for the rest of the country. It's going to be sorted out in 50 different states by 50 different judges or panels of judges. And it's just chaos. And it's going to be chaos, frankly, for not just many months, but many years to come.
And Kim, you touched on something which was the increasing politicization of abortion and abortion rights. Not only were we talking about attempts at legislation, but there was also attempts at, and successful attempts at, harming people who were seeking abortions or doctors who were providing abortions. Could you speak a little bit about that and sort of the ways in which the vitriol played out in real life?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think one of the scariest things is that there are people who provide reproductive health care, including abortion and often other care as well, who literally are going to work with security, and they're wearing vests in case somebody shoots at them. And there's enormous security around abortion clinics, where there are still daily protests where people who are going to get abortions are being just bombarded and harassed as they walk into clinics. And so this has been a really, frankly, dangerous space for people to practice medicine in, which is ludicrous. And I think what that means is that we've actually gotten to a point where certainly the abortion providers I know, but lots of other abortion providers who I've met, are people who are deeply personally committed to protecting women, who are deeply personally committed to the bodily autonomy of women, and who are deeply personally committed to this is an aspect of healthcare to which everybody should have access. Right. And so, there's something really stark about people who are, having protesters come to their home or publish their addresses and their kids' names and where their kids go to school. I mean, just enormous harassment that people have dealt with. And that means a lot of people got out of the work of providing abortions, which again, sort of brought us down to this, clinics closing, Mississippi, which is where Jackson Women's Health is. That clinic has since closed after Dobbs. It was the last abortion clinic in Mississippi. So what we're seeing is some very brave people who are continuing to do the work, and they're doing it at great risk to their own safety and their own health. Wow.
So that's a perfect segue to the health and medical consequences here. Simone, as Kim has pointed out, doctors have faced, and doctors and providers and people associated with the medical industry have faced consequences as a result of abortion access and rights for decades, whether it's, consequences to their own livelihood or their own well-being, or consequences in terms of limitations as to what it is that they can actually provide their patients. You're a pediatrician who specializes in adolescent medicine. Can you tell us a little bit about the very real implications for doctors and patients across the country as a result of Dobbs? And in particular, adolescents, I think, are some of the most vulnerable as a result of the Dobbs decision, yet we don't really hear about the effect and impact on adolescents in the news, or the ways in which it may jeopardize their lives or stall their livelihoods. So from your perspective, how has the landscape shifted for people seeking abortion or other reproductive care, and how has the landscape shifted for doctors and providers as well?
So one of the things that I noticed in all of the media coverage in the aftermath of the Dobbs decision was how little people know about reproductive health and what the definitions of pregnancy and viability and all of that is, right? One of the very real issues that came up was, you can have a termination up to 6 weeks of pregnancy. And I heard a congressman say, 6 weeks? You should know in 6 weeks what you're going to do with a pregnancy. That's enough. Like, wait, no, how are you counting a pregnancy? In medicine, we all know, but lay people don't necessarily know that we count a pregnancy based on the first day of your last period. And so by the time a person has missed their period, that's been 4 weeks has passed, and you have to notice in those next 2 weeks, not only know that you have missed a period, know that you are pregnant, but also know what you want to do with that pregnancy. We talked about the rights, reproductive rights, as being a matter of class. Well, adolescents are kind of inherently poor. So whether they come from well-to-do families or poor families, they don't have access to their own income. They don't have access to their insurance without having their parents find out, so that if they want to seek medical care, whether it's birth control, whether it's terminating a pregnancy, they typically have to go around these other measures that have been in place to kind of block what they have to do. So that by the time a teenager realizes that, one, I am indeed pregnant, and two, I have decided I don't want to continue with this pregnancy, very often we're way beyond 6 weeks, and has nothing to do with personal irresponsibility. This is just how life goes. And that that people who are outside of medicine are having this conversation is very harmful to those of us in medicine, but then also very harmful to the patients. I had a conversation with a patient today about whether she wanted her child to be on asthma medication. And, she just had this feeling about not over medicating her child. And that this conversation was a conversation between me and that parent. It had nothing to do with the government. It had nothing to do with legislators, it had nothing to do with judges. It was a conversation based on my medical knowledge and her sense of how the medications was affecting her child, and how also the medication was going to affect the family because everybody's part of a larger group. So that now that there's legislators and judges involved in all of that just makes it so much more difficult. And also for my patients in particular, very, very scary. You know, when you think about teenagers who have gone through pregnancy, who've hidden pregnancies for months and months and months, and you say, well, how could you and why did you? You know, there's a lot of psychological issues there. Oh, I'm so sorry. My lights are on automatic timers. Hold up. Okay. I'm so sorry.
No worries.
So when you think of how can somebody have, you know, that prom baby or the baby that they had in the closet, there's a lot that goes into why a person might be in denial about being in pregnancy, and then why they would not have sought care, because there's so many layers to trying to access care. I had been invited once upon a time to practice in a certain state, and they said, oh, Dr. Manigault, we really need you here. And I said, oh, absolutely not. Because the adolescents in that state had no rights to get contraceptive care. They had no rights to get abortions without having to go either through their parents or through a judge. And I said there was no way that I could leave such a lovely state to practice adolescent medicine like New Jersey to go there and have to fight this uphill battle. I'd rather stay here where I could, you know, show this is what happens when we're successful in this. One thing I did want to mention is how, again, there's so little lay information about reproductive care, reproduction, just the science and the biology behind it. And, you know, when you think of how just little things that you don't think about on a regular basis, we do because we see it a lot more often. But let's say you have a woman who is miscarrying, and it is called, it's what we call an inevitable miscarriage. There's no way that this pregnancy is going to be able to go forward. Or a woman who's got an ectopic pregnancy in certain states, as far as from what I've heard, what I've read, is that they're saying, no, under no circumstances can you terminate this pregnancy. Well, the host's life is in danger. And if you can say that the legislation that you're trying to write excludes even those measures, then that tells me that you are not about the rights of an infant. You are about controlling women's bodies. And, you know, there's so many different combinations and permutations of where this is all going to go wrong, state by state, especially when you're dealing with 50 different states and 50 different sets of laws. And for everybody or no one to be able to get on a single accord is kind of scary for us in medicine.
Wow. Simone, you know, we often talk about denying people abortion or forcing them to not be able to seek an abortion as imposing forced pregnancy on people. And when you add to that the layer of lack of autonomy that an adolescent has, right? It's not just forced, it's something beyond forced, right? It's forced without any will or say in the matter at all. And that really is striking. You mentioned other states. And you mentioned, you know, an anecdote of yourself being unwilling to go to another state to practice because of the ways in which that practice was limited for you. Have you been hearing from doctors across the country about how the Dobbs decision has impacted their work?
I can't say that I have. I kind of practice in a bubble. I'm Jersey born, Jersey raised. So that the laws for me as a female growing up in New Jersey and knowing that I did have access to birth control without my parents' knowledge, that I did have access to abortions without my parents' knowledge or without my partner's knowledge. And then I did some training in New York, which was even more liberal. So, you know, the people who I'm around tend to be New York and New Jersey type of folks, and we are not as affected. We have, though, talked about making sure that we do what we can to maintain the rights that we have in New York and New Jersey, and trying to help our friends across the country. I'm just like everybody else. I'm in the Facebook group of Black women physicians, and from time to time we do talk about it. There's a lot of OBGYNs in that group, and everyone's needs, everybody's concerns are so different because what's happening in their states are just so different from one place to the other. There's no one like highway that everybody's on. Everybody's really trying to get to the same conclusion, but they're really taking these really convoluted paths to get there.
There are a lot of doctors in the South Asian community, and in my conversations, both anecdotally and somewhat empirically, I've heard from friends and distant relatives that people are rethinking their specializations as a result of all of the controversy around Dobbs and what could be an actual fulfilling practice for them. And unfortunately, I think, and again, I don't have much evidence yet for this, but I think we're going to see a generation of fewer OBGYN doctors.
I think so too. I think a lot of doctors are already avoiding OBGYN because there's so much, there's so many legal suits, lawsuits, malpractice suits associated with pregnancy and birth and postpartum periods. And I think that's so unfortunate. I was going to go into OBGYN and didn't. And I feel like, wow, I really should have. But I think part of the problem is that those people who are avoiding the topic or avoiding that specialty aren't really looking at the bigger picture. We need people to take care of people, abortion or not abortion. I am pro-choice, but I'm very pro-contraception. If we have broader access to contraception, we don't need to have this conversation. And if people are avoiding going into OBGYN, if they're avoiding going into practices or even practicing reproductive care in their offices, family practitioners talk about reproduction. I hope adult medicine people talk about contraception. There are all of my friends who are pediatricians, we're very into reproductive care, but I also kind of have a little bit of a bias in terms of who my friends are. But it's going to be a huge lack, just like we're losing teachers all over the place. There's going to be a huge, void of people, the best people who'll be able to help in these matters.
Thanks, Simone. I'm going to bring in Jackie to the conversation. Jackie, Planned Parenthood is both a provider of reproductive health care and also an advocate for pro-abortion policies. What have been the implications of the Dobbs decision on patients and providers in New Jersey?
Thanks so much, Amal. Yeah, I think one of the things that we sort of assumed would happen is that we would start to see people from all around the country where access has been reduced start coming to New Jersey, and that is happening. So patients from Georgia, Florida, Louisiana, Texas. There was one patient who came to us from Ohio and actually drove through Pennsylvania. And it's not that abortion is illegal in Pennsylvania, it's that there are such high restrictions and barriers to access in Pennsylvania. It was more advantageous for her to just come to New Jersey and to get the care that she needed there. One of the things that we have been really trying to express to individuals, both in New Jersey here, but anyone that we speak to, is that Planned Parenthood will see you and serve you regardless of your ability to pay, regardless of immigration status, gender identity, insurance access, you name it. And so what we have done is really try to boost the number of patient navigators that we have. So those individuals can help both for individuals that are here in New Jersey, but also folks who are faced with a really daunting choice, right? Can they pay for a plane ticket? or can they pay for their abortion? And for us, a lot of the work that we've been trying to do is to articulate to our supporters and our allies and our donors how much their concentration is needed in this moment, right? Knowing that people are coming to New Jersey and that knowing that we are in a position to provide them high quality care when they're not able to receive that at home. I think one of the things that we are dealing with, and this has already been echoed by the amazing panel that we've got with us tonight, but the amount of misinformation or lack of knowledge or confusion has always been there. And now we have all of those things coupled with a very heavy dose of fear. And so there are so many folks who are coming to us, and it is not until the clinician is engaged with the conversation on follow-ups and next steps that the patient will disclose, oh, actually, I'm not from here. And I think that there are just the layers of trauma and fear and heartbreak, frankly, that people have kind of gone through to get to this place in time. When they feel like they can't even have an honest conversation with their provider, right? That they're feeling that much scrutiny or that much someone is looking over their shoulder about what could happen. So we are trying to make sure that we can provide services for anyone, regardless of their ability to pay. One of the things that we've done, this was pre-Dobbs decision, but has been a real one of those great, we did it before we needed it mechanisms. We provide local transportation services via Uber Health for all needs. So whether it's somebody dealing with an needing their UTI is bothering them, and they're like, I got to get in because I'm uncomfortable, or someone who is seeking a termination, we make sure that transportation is not the barrier. Unfortunately, New Jersey is a place without a car, you are really in a tough spot in many parts of our state. And so for us, this was a really important thing to do that, like, again, we've had for a while, but have really seen the benefit of in this moment. We also have expanded several of our centers' hours to include nights and weekends to address the fact that this part of the country is now facing additional, sort of increased patient load because of what's going on in the rest of the state, or excuse me, the rest of the country. So one of the things that I think was interesting to me, and again, this is just anecdotal because these are just, sort of stories as we're hearing it from clinicians. We're also now seeing patients from New York coming to New Jersey for services, not because New York doesn't have the right or the access, as I think it was mentioned before, New York in some ways sometimes even has more progressive policies because of sheer capacity. So if you are an individual from a far-flung place and you're thinking of a big city, you might be thinking of New York City before you're thinking of Trenton, New Jersey. And so what is now happening is we are now seeing New York City residents coming into New Jersey for procedures because the just capacity is not there in New York. And so I think that has been one of the more surprising, too early to say it's a trend because these are just sort of anecdotes that we're picking up as we go and as we learn, but has been fascinating to see just what is going on with patient migration around the country to get the services that they need.
Thanks, Jackie. We've got two questions that I want to take in turn here before we continue with the panel. So Kimberly asks, how can we look at individuals who want to seek an abortion care in a safe state, but who are denied their right to travel due to criminal legal involvement, pretrial detainees, et cetera? So I think what the question is, what happens when somebody who is in a state where abortion is prohibited or limited wants to seek an abortion in a state where it's legal to seek an abortion, yet there are attempts to potentially hinder or prosecute that individual from seeking that abortion. I'll start very quickly, if I may. In New Jersey, we've been thinking about that a lot. Our legal director at the ACLU of New Jersey, in partnership with other lawyers across the state, has been thinking through this question of what are individual rights in this context, and how is it that one state can prohibit abortion and another state can allow it, and whether or not there's going to be parity across the states in acknowledging. There have been states that have said explicitly that they are going to disallow people from seeking abortions in other states, and that is a real, I would say, untested question. We haven't yet seen what courts will do when faced with that conflict. Thankfully, in New Jersey, we have statements and law that say that the government will not cooperate with an investigation when an outside state tries to prosecute somebody for seeking an abortion in our state. But I welcome the thoughts of our experts here. I saw Kim unmute, so would you like to chime in?
Well, you know what I wanted to chime in with, because as I was reading the question, I was thinking of people who actually cannot travel, right? Not that they're afraid to travel, but they can't travel, right? Because they're incarcerated or they're in immigration detention, or, you know, they're a young person who's in some sort of facility. And those, you know, you sort of started with this, Amal, but, you know, it's the most vulnerable people, the most vulnerable people who get impacted by these rules, right? And so let's say that you were incarcerated and in another set of circumstances, you would have been able to be, you know, brought to a local hospital or brought to a local facility. But now the closest facility is 3 states away, right? What is that gonna look like? And how are people gonna get, frankly, the representation that they would need in order to fight for their ability to leave in order to get an abortion, right? And so there are lots of people, you already don't get great health care when you're incarcerated. So imagine, you know, we see pregnant women who are having babies on the floor of prison cells, right? So what's gonna happen to folks who need abortion is they're gonna stay pregnant, or they're gonna hurt themselves because they don't have access to any other way to terminate that pregnancy.
I'll just add that, you know, we're really now in the Wild West of this. This has just happened, the overturning of Roe, and we don't know. You ask a very good question, and we're seeing already in various states, you know, decisions being made that we couldn't have predicted. For example, there was a Planned Parenthood chapter in Montana where abortion is legal, where they announced a few months ago that they would be requiring proof of residency when providing a medical abortion, so that they would not then later be prosecuted. So we don't know the answers. These are very difficult things. They're going to play out. You know, all the people who opposed Roe said, "Oh, just overturn it and it'll be nice and tidy and everything will be." But well, actually, we now instead of having to only deal with one federal situation, have to deal with 50 different sort of legislatures, and these things are very, very complicated. And lawyers are going to be dealing with this sort of thicket of laws and questions over many years to come.
You know, at the ACLU, we represent, our national organization represented a young person who was incarcerated in immigration detention and needed an abortion, and thankfully that was, you know, ultimately provided to them. But you know, we are going to see cases like that emerge throughout the country. Thankfully, in New Jersey, our law says that people who are in state custody also have the right to an abortion. It's not limited to those who are outside of state custody. It seems obvious to somebody in my shoes, but clearly it needed to be reiterated in law, and I'm thankful that it was. We have another question here about you know, mailing of abortion medication. I believe right now the FDA permits mailing of abortion medication, but however, I think there are attempts, especially in Texas, to prohibit the mailing of abortion medication. So to the whole panel, what are your thoughts, and what can be done to stop the prohibition of mailing abortion medication if that is looming out there?
Well, one thing that needs to happen is that, you know, right now you still need a prescription, right? I mean, so one thing that needs to happen, you know, you sort of think about how long it took us to even get to the point where you could get medication abortion with a prescription, right? So many years after it was already happening in Europe. So that's always going to be a barrier. And, you know, honestly, that, you know, one of the things that I think puts us in such a different position from before 1973, you know, 50% of abortions in the early, 90+% of abortions take place in the first trimester, and 50% of those abortions are medication abortions. That's a huge proportion of people who are terminating pregnancies. And there are lots of folks who are not going to be concerned about driving pills across the state line or mailing pills across the state line, because you can very safely self-manage a medication abortion at home. And so I think what we're going to see is, states can make whatever rules they want to about what you can or can't mail, but they can't just start ripping open all these packages from the US Postal Service, right, in order to get access. And so what I really worry about is what's going to happen is on those, the off chance that somebody has a bad outcome and they show up at an emergency room and then they say, you know what, this doesn't look like it was just a miscarriage. I think you did something, right? And then that's where we sort of get into the criminalization piece. And that's what I'm more concerned about, quite frankly.
And we've seen that already, right? Like we've seen that a number of times. I'm sorry, I think Simone was going to say something.
No, I agree, but I also think that even like whether there's the appearance of, oh, you medicated yourself or you didn't, just having a miscarriage is now suspect.
Yeah.
Everybody's giving you the side eye, and you know how many miscarriages happen? They're very common. And that, in Texas where they want to they want to criminalize the physician, criminalize the pregnant person, and then you can get a bounty for reporting those people. It just means that anytime you see somebody with heavy bleeding, like, you must have taken an abortion pill. It is absolutely the Wild Wild West.
Yeah. And if I can just add a couple of pieces to this, I think to Kimberly's point, these procedures are safe when we know where these pills come from. They're regulated. They're prescribed. They're legit, for lack of a better word. Amal, I think of the work that you and I had done, in years past on drug-related issues, and how so much of the sort of the gray zone, the black market of things, the danger that could be there for people who are going to take pills that they're going to just hope are the right thing, right? They're going to hope that it's that is not how you practice medicine. That's really bad public health measure, right? It's really scary. And to the point about looking at miscarriages, for any person who has been in that experience, those are some of the darkest moments, perhaps, of your life. Especially when we, frequently villainize later term procedures. Those are families that have nurseries, names picked out. They're getting ready to welcome a baby and are being handed probably the most devastating blow of their lives. I can't imagine having to deal with all of that on top of the worry about criminal persecution in that horrific moment, right? And that's what we're talking about here, because I think when we start to really open this up more widely, and this was talked about a lot when Justice Barrett's name began to circulate, even fertility treatments could be on the chopping block. And there were lots of folks who came out and said, wait a second, some of the beliefs that she holds run antithetical to, quote unquote, family values of people who are trying to grow and expand their families. And with everything we know, the class comes down to this. If you want to have access to a termination, money will get it for you. If you want to have access to expand your family, money will get it for you. The most vulnerable are the ones who need these protections, these safeguards, these measures to make sure that they're not getting black market, abortion pills that God only knows what could do to them, right? And so I think that's, we can talk really big and we can talk really big picture about what this means, but the dire straits that people are being put in and the choices that they're being made to have in this moment aren't going to get any easier by any of this posturing and any sort of finagling that may or may not happen with the post office.
It strikes me that the perfect storm, perhaps, of bad laws, stigma, perhaps youthfulness, and potentially class and economic justice issues come together, and it should be no surprise then that the few significant cases of infanticide, quote unquote, that we've seen in the United States have been against young women of color. That's how how toxic and how vitriolic and how problematic some of these situations can become when having a terrible miscarriage or having terrible circumstances can lead to criminal prosecution. And not only are you grieving the loss that you experience and the trauma that you experience, you're now dealing with a lifetime of consequences as a result of your liberty being taken away. And what a heartbreaking episode, and clearly a series of decisions allowed for it, they could have been preventable. So this question is for both Kim and Jackie. As we've talked about, there's now a patchwork of situations all across the country in response to Dobbs. Can you explain how states have responded and the varying degrees to which abortion is allowed in some states, and how it's prohibited in others, and what in particular New Jersey is doing to protect the right to an abortion?
I'll talk broadly and then you talk Jersey. Does that make sense? Okay.
Perfect.
So broadly, there are probably about 13. I mean, it's actually hard to give a good number because it's shifting day by day because there is so much litigation out there, right? So Georgia's ban was put on hold for a week and then it was back on. It's a mess. So, we have a series of states that have different gestational limits. Some have total bans, some have 6 weeks, some have 15 weeks. Some have a life exception. Health exception doesn't seem to be particularly interesting to states anymore. I think that's a deep, deep problem, right? So you can imagine a set of circumstances where your patient isn't going to die, but you could preserve fertility, right? If you started to do something, but you can't do that either because that's a health exception, not a life exception. So, we see those sorts of things going on. Obviously, states where there is a ban, we were talking earlier about healthcare providers and people going into obstetrics. Well, you have to get trained somewhere. So if you're going to medical school in a state where you can't even get trained to perform abortions, what is that going to look like? So we've seen, the whole gamut, the miscarriage management that's going on, the lack of access to medications that are used not just for abortion, but for other kinds of diseases, rheumatoid arthritis, these other things. Pharmacists who are refusing to dispense medication, which they are allowed to do, granted, but they shouldn't. So we've seen that going on. And then, the other thing that I want to make sure to put this on the table, even though it's not really a response to this question, it's just something I find really important to say. This country has the highest maternal mortality rate of any developed nation. And Black women are 2 to 5 times more likely to die in pregnancy or childbirth than are white women. All of these states that are so busy passing legislation to ban abortion, they're not extending Medicaid for postpartum care. They don't care about access to prenatal care. They don't care about a social safety net so that these kids have access to to housing and to education. Jackson, Mississippi didn't have drinkable water just a few weeks ago, right? This is the country that we're living in. So we're seeing all of this, legislation and litigation related to abortion, when quite frankly, if you really cared about saving lives, abortion's not even where you start. It's absolutely not where you start. So I'll stop there.
Wow. Yep.
On that same vein, I can't help but call attention to the fact that the same year that we are dealing with Dobbs, we have formula shortages and child Tylenol shortages. I'm the mom of a 9-year-old, and I have tons of friends who have little ones. And we are talking about, women of privilege and access and resources and all of this, and they can't get formula for their babies, especially any parent that is dealing with a higher, more sensitive formula than what you're getting at the grocery store. That's the America that we're living in. To your point, though, or to your question, Amal, New Jersey has done a lot of good work, some of it pre-Dobbs, some of it post-Dobbs, but all in the last year. So in January, Governor Murphy signed the Freedom of Reproductive Choice Act into law that codified abortion into state law. We had 40 years of state Supreme Court precedent, but this put it, squarely into the state statute, which was important. We also worked to and ACLU was with Planned Parenthood in this work, legislation that bars extradition for people. I think we talked about this already. We also passed legislation that works on protecting patient information and provider information from out-of-state scrutiny. And then we also found that there were historic investments in the state's budget of last year to family planning providers, for security, training, and facilities for abortion providers. And I think all of that goes to show that New Jersey has really been trying to either get ahead of or be on top of the issue at hand. What I think is kind of buttressing up against Kim's point earlier, New Jersey's also done a lot on the full scope of reproductive health services that are being addressed here. There was legislation passed this year that enables patients to get 12 months of contraception prescribed and administered at once. So you don't have to go back and forth to the health center if you're coming to a Planned Parenthood or even to your pharmacy to get a year's worth of your birth control. And First Lady Murphy has made maternal mortality a huge cornerstone of her work, and has some of the hallmark pieces of legislation out of this administration has been on that. So 365 days post-delivery, individuals are able to stay on Medicaid. And I believe the nation's first, if not only, home visiting program, regardless of socioeconomic or demographics. So meaning that any new family through birth or adoption that brings a little one into their home gets a visit and gets, in that visit, an assessment and resources if available to them. To Kim's point, the Commonwealth Fund actually just released last week terrifying but outstanding research that looks at abortion restrictions and maternal mortality, and finds that in states where abortion access is being highly regulated and restricted, that maternal mortality outcomes are really, really poor. And I think, to me, that speaks to a larger mindset of where is the priority, right? If we want to talk about bringing more kids into the world and having family values and all of those things, then the very least we should be doing is knocking it out of the park and just doing a phenomenal work when it comes to maternal and infant mortality. And in fact, we're not. We're doing poorly, and the United States is candidly at the bottom of our peers around the world when it comes to these things. Here in New Jersey, when we were doing this analysis years ago, I had the privilege of serving in the Murphy administration at the very beginning of his first term. It was safer to give birth in large portions of the globe than it was to give birth in New Jersey if you were a woman of color. That should make everyone stand up and take notice and really think about how we can move, and thankfully we have since moved policies to address some of these disparities.
I often say that the United States is the country of injustice compounded, and because we have layers of injustice, right? It's not any one thing that we see that serves as the bullet of injustice. It's all compounded, especially if you are a part of a marginalized community. But Jackie, there's still more that New Jersey could be doing to advance the right to an abortion, right? What's left for our state to do?
Sure. I think that a lot of our time right now, we've talked about, targeting the most vulnerable and looking at folks who are struggling against a variety of factors that make access to care more meaningful. Put quite simply, rights without access are meaningless. And so talking about ways that we can buttress up the providers that exist in the state and create more opportunities to either bring providers into the fold. So looking at APNs, advanced practice nurses, looking at midwives and their role in all of this, making sure that there is adequate training available. I've joked, if you offer a scholarship to a university that doesn't exist, that's a problem, right? And so how do we make sure that we have the right trainings available, especially for mid-career professionals? Taking folks who are just beginning their clinical lives and teaching them these skills is one thing, but being able to help navigate individuals to sort of work to the scope of their license and to the fullness of their license, I think is really important. Funding remains to be an evergreen issue. How do we ensure that those who are providing services are being reimbursed adequately through Medicaid, being able to pull down state dollars where appropriate, are not dealing with unnecessary burdens in terms of a regulatory framework. And the big one consistently is what happens for those that are caught either on the bubble or outside of the bubble of Medicaid. And so if you're a Medicaid, if you're a New Jerseyan who receives Medicaid dollars, or services through the Medicaid system, you have a phenomenal depth and scope. Abortion is covered, contraception is covered. Getting access to a clinician might be a hurdle depending on where in the state you live. But for those who are the working poor, immigrants who are sort of left out of Medicaid, but are not eligible or can't get into the traditional insurance framework, those individuals are sort of the evergreen folks who are struggling, much like it was when we were working on the Affordable Care Act and trying to get people on coverage. It's how do you take the working poor and immigrants who are ineligible and make sure that they have access? I think there's more that the legislature has looked at to do in the Reproductive Equity Act. And I think that there are creative solutions that departments and agencies are looking at as well to help us meet those goals.
Some of the things that you just pointed out, just to summarize, we need insurance to cover abortion and be required to do so. We need to make sure that people who are undocumented or underinsured or uninsured have access to funding for abortions, right? Because as you say, rights without access are meaningless, and what good is a right if you can't afford it, right? So we need to make sure that we get our lawmakers to consider the Reproductive Equity Act and make sure that there's a pathway to access for all. Josh and Simone, Josh, this is sort of a unique question because I'm asking both of you at the same time, but I think it makes sense. So Josh, as a historian and a writer, and Simone as somebody who treats children and adolescents, you both have unique perspectives and a vested interest in the future, as we all do, but you get to see it from a different perspective. Josh, what gives you hope about the future, knowing what you know about the way in which Roe came to be? Sometimes we think of history repeating itself as a bad thing, but sometimes it can be a good thing. And how do we make sure we get good versions of history repeating itself? And Simone, similarly, what's the world you envision for the future of the patients that you see and the generations to come? Right now, we're living in a place where the people that you're treating have fewer rights than their parents, and than their parents did when they were growing up, and that feels like an injustice. And what can we do to see a better world out there?
So I'll say, look, history teaches us nothing if not this. Politicians have no conviction, okay? They don't. Politicians care about getting elected, and when politics demand it, they fall right in line. And the issue of abortion teaches us that very, very clearly. We won't go into all the details, but it was really between 1975 and 1985 when abortion becomes really politicized in this country. And Democrats had to become pro-choice. Republicans had to become pro-life, and remarkably, in both parties, they did. They fell right in line. Politicians flipped. Reagan and Bush went from pro-choice to pro-life. Dick Gephardt, Al Gore, Ted Kennedy, Jesse Jackson, they went the exact other way. This can happen again, and we saw in the 2022 midterm elections, we just saw that extreme pro-life positions are not at all popular. And if that continues to be the case, politicians will conform. And right now in that community, those who oppose Roe and those who are in favor of the overturning of it, there is a debate in that world among the sort of incrementalists and the absolutists. And you can see it sort of in the welter of things that are being sort of put forward that Kim was referring to in all these different states. So that's number one. And what do we do about that? We vote. You vote, and politicians really, that's what gets their attention. The second thing I would just say is that it's very easy to rail against Roe when overturning it was merely hypothetical, but now it's real. And now politicians have to own the consequences of Dobbs. Not only, for example, the sort of anger of women who no longer have access to legal abortion, but also in the future, there are going to be many children who were born unwanted. My book I write a lot about that. For example, Jane Roe, Norma McCorvey, she never had the abortion. She had 3 children she did not wish to have. And all 3 of them suffered enormously because of that. In fact, the youngest of them, the quote unquote Roe baby, who literally would not exist had Roe already been decided when she was conceived, she came out and said, I am upset that the Supreme Court has overturned Roe v. Wade. That's a very powerful thing. I would just add one more thing, in terms of what to do. Justice Blackmun, who wrote the majority opinion in Roe, he wrote a very powerful thing in a sort of preamble to it. He says that, he acknowledges that good human beings can have differences of opinion, but he says, what often determines that opinion is exposure to a story, to a person, to what he terms the raw edges of human existence. If you know somebody who has had an abortion, for example, you understand it. Suddenly it's not some crazy hypothetical. You understand that good human beings can decide for very compelling reasons to have an abortion. I think that's very important. And I think that people should tell their stories. I think that they should encourage other people to tell their stories, because that really is the single most effective way to change a mind.
Thanks, Josh. Simone?
Well, I have this great position to not only practice adolescent medicine at work, but at home too. I have 3 adolescent daughters. And one thing that I've noticed, not just among my daughters, but among their friends and among the girls that I work with in groups outside of my job, is they're angry. And, of all of the things that this next generation is fed up, they're fed up with gun rights and everything else. This was something that really, really hit them, and that they wanted to register to vote, and they wanted to vote and get people to vote and understand what positions they took and how is it possible that they have less rights and access than the generation before them and the generation before them. In the time that I've been a physician, which is longer than I'd like to admit, we've seen emergency contraception become a thing, become a medication, and it also has become available over the counter. It's very expensive. And from my perspective, in dealing with adolescents, because it is expensive and it's small, it's very pocketable. So it's kept behind the counter in the pharmacy, maybe not behind the pharmacist counter in CVS, but behind the counter in CVS, so that a teenager has to go up and ask for it, which is very embarrassing. It's embarrassing when you have to ask for them to unlock that case to get the condoms out too, just to decrease those, what we say in adolescent medicine is decrease the barriers to care. And in that way, we've already done it. We've allowed them to be able to get it on their own, but still somehow, we're going to let you have it, but we're going to put it under lock and key so that you can't steal it. Well, there's really no reason why emergency contraception needs to be $55. It can be $12. Condoms don't need to be as expensive as they are. So I would like to see, healthcare, of course, in general being more affordable, but contraception being more affordable. And just as the emergency contraception has become an over-the-counter medication, I'd like to see other birth control methods like birth control pills, and then eventually even the abortion pill being able to be accessed without having to even have a prescription, to have oversight perhaps, but not necessarily with a prescription. I am energized that these girls are energized, but also that their moms are too. that, you know, all of the moms of the girls that I know are angry and they've asked me how they can help. So it does give me hope. I tend to be quite the pessimist, but you can't be a pessimist in medicine because you always have to think that things are going to change. And this is one of the things that I am very optimistic about, not just in New Jersey, but I think there's been such an incredible backlash across the entire country that I think it's going to go back in a more, as far as I see, positive direction.
We have a question here from the audience from Manisha. Should we put more resources into making medication abortion more available, especially in states that currently don't allow it? Will fighting that battle likely to get more results? Maybe we can go to, I see Kim. Yep.
Yeah, I mean, an abortion ban is an abortion ban, right? So a state that says that you can't have an abortion, you can't go in and say, well, what about medication abortions, right? Because they're still going to be banned there. So, you know, I think that the power of medication abortion is that, and this is sort of what, you know, what Jackie was talking about earlier, it doesn't, you're supposed to get a prescription, right? And yet the internet allows people to get a whole bunch of things that they otherwise wouldn't be able to have access to. So there's a way in which that is broadening access, but at the same time creating this risk that, you know, there will be people who send pills that are not actually abortion pills, or who send things that are going to be dangerous. So, you know, medication abortion is not going to fix our problem here, as long as there are still states that continue to ban access to abortion, because every abortion, doesn't matter, will be banned.
Any other thoughts on that question? No. And we have another question here. How can teachers or parents or other adult role models be mobilized to impart more wisdom about responsible sexual activity to kids and to adults? That feels like a question for Simone.
Yeah, it's interesting, you know, the question about teachers, because across the country, we also have this, you know, movement of what you can talk about in school and what you can't. I come from a family of teachers, and it seems as though more and more and more responsibilities falling on teachers. You have to, you know, they have to be taught, they have to teach morals, they have to teach ABCs, they have to teach them how to, you know, have decorum in society. And I don't know that it's necessarily fair to place all of that on teachers. And honestly, my perspective, I've been a sex educator since I was 5. And when I look at, you know, the people around me, I'm kind of scared actually to leave that education in the parents' hands, because people are very misinformed. And so that just spreads. I would like to see a lot more adolescent docs in the world. Or even more pediatricians. You'd be amazed at how many pediatricians are uncomfortable with this topic. I have patients all the time who tell me, well, nobody's ever checked me. Nobody's ever checked my pubertal development. Nobody's ever asked me if I've had my period. And I'm the first one who's asked, and they're 15. That's incredible. There are so many pediatricians who are embarrassed pediatricians and family practitioners who turn red when it comes to the topic. So that there is a shame put on it still in 2022, 2023. There's still so much shame and embarrassment associated with it that it just all needs to be, you know, I tell my patients, listen, oh yeah, I'm going to ask you about your period, just like I'm going to ask you how often you poop. If you had a problem with constipation, you tell me, right? And this is something that is very biological, is very normal. Everybody does this, everybody gets this. So it just has to be part of an everyday conversation with no stigma attached. And, you know, I think part of the problem, you know, I don't want to say problem, but part of the issue is religion. And how much of that has to do with religion. And everyone in this country, I think this country is awesome that you're able to practice whatever religion that you want, but then that means who's doing the teaching, who's teaching the kids in school, who are teaching the kids at home. You really need to have someone like a doctor, I don't know, talk about these issues in a very straightforward, biological, matter-of-fact way without putting in the morals. When I have parents in front of me, I say, look, it's not my job to tell them whether or not they can have sex, whether or not they can use contraception. That's not my job. That's your job. I'm here to tell them biologically how it works. When I go home, I teach my kids values. I don't want them to learn their values on the street. And that's your job. So, you know, there really needs to be a movement, not just from, you know, from kids up, like from elementary school up, that there's no stigma when it comes to all of your biology, including your reproductive systems, but even in college and med school, to be able to get people to talk about it when you're pre-med, be able to talk about these things and not be embarrassed and not stutter. And it's just another bodily function, you know, to me it is. But I right now, in how the world stands, I'd be very nervous to put it in the hands of parents and and teachers. I really would.
I'm glad you lifted up religion in this context, Simone, because we have a question in here about the faith perspective. Is there any credence given to the faith perspective when discussing abortion? And you know, I have to, you know, of course, we know that there are some religions that are very vocal about their anti-abortion stances, but there are also some religions that support the right to an abortion and actually are very vocal about that. And I think more attention needs to be given to those religions and those sects than the ones that are so vocal and perhaps powerful and wealthy and are anti-abortion and put a lot of money behind anti-abortion politicians and anti-abortion policies.
You know, I'll just add one thing about that. You know, the perspective even of, you know, we think of the evangelical Christian community and we think of the Catholic Church, obviously, when you're speaking that. It's important to point out, though, you mentioned the word perspective, that their perspectives have changed a lot. Like, this didn't just come out on high. We think abortion's horrible forevermore from the beginning. No, it's not true. In fact, take the evangelical community, the largest, you know, the Southern Baptist Convention is the largest evangelical community in America. You know that until 1980, they were completely pro-choice. Okay, so what happened? The moral majority happened. Ronald Reagan happened. Okay, it's important to know the history here. Linda Coffey, who was the lawyer who represented Jane Roe, one of the two lawyers, she is the matriarch of Roe v. Wade. She was a religious Baptist woman, and there was no contradiction between her deep felt religious conviction and her being a fierce, ardent feminist. So even the Catholic Church, which is truly incredible, until 1917, that's when things really became codified in this hard way. For all but 3 of the previous 800 years before that, even the Catholic Church distinguished between abortions pre and post quickening. It only sort of had this draconian line saying that no abortion was, you know, homicide, et cetera, and a woman was excommunicated if the abortion took place after quickening. They don't talk about that now. So I mention all this because it's important to know the history. It's important to know that even religious perspectives from those churches have changed enormously recently.
Thanks for bringing that into the conversation, Josh. So I think we're close to end of time here. I just want to ask our panelists in 1 minute or less to share with us in turn what next steps our audience can take, if any, to support your work or to be vocal on this issue. So let's start with Kimberly, please. Kim.
So there are a couple things that I want to say. I mean, I'm going to put aside voting, right? We all know that vote. But we also, the same Supreme Court that gave us Dobbs is gleefully, right, ruining the Voting Rights Act. So, right, we have to keep that in mind. So a couple of things. One is, you know, Josh was making the point earlier that people who know someone who have had an abortion tend to sort of think about the issue differently. 1 in 4 women will have an abortion in their lifetimes, and many of them will never talk about it because we live in a country where the abortion stigma is so strong. So I think there's great value in people telling their abortion stories if you are comfortable doing so, because I do think that it has an impact. But I also think it's very hard for people to tell those stories because there's still so much judgment that goes along with that. The other thing I wanted to say is that, and this goes back to something that Jackie was saying earlier, it's amazing. I work with a practical support network down here in South Jersey, and it's amazing how small things can be sometimes that keep someone from being able to access an abortion. You don't have somebody to pick you up after the procedure and take you home. And so if you're someone who is willing to open up your house, who's willing to drive somebody to a clinic and drive them home, if you're someone, who's willing to chip in money to an abortion fund, right? There are lots of ways that are, not going to hugely change your life, but may in fact deeply, deeply impact somebody else's life.
Thanks so much, Kim. Josh.
Yeah, obviously, echoing voting, it really is very important. But also in terms of what you were just saying now, in terms of, stigma and sharing a story, right? And there are lots of ways to do that. And this goes back to even pre-Roe. There were sort of speak outs when people would share their stories and on and on and on. I just want to mention again how important this is. Obviously, we talked about the sort of composition of the Supreme Court as the ultimate sort of, they have the last word right now. Well, what was very interesting to me in learning about Roe, both Justice Blackmun, who wrote the majority opinion, and Justice Powell, who more than Blackmun was the reason that the cutoff moved from the end of the first trimester, which Justice Blackmun had initially put forward, up until viability. Both of them had personal experiences, personal exposure to people very close to them who had had abortions or who had had unwanted pregnancies reroute their lives. Justice Blackmun didn't mention when he talked about in that preamble about exposure that his own daughter, Sally, had just gotten unhappily pregnant in college and that this rerouted her life. And most powerfully, Justice Powell, who was the one who, again, is the great champion of pushing the point of legal abortion up to viability. He tells a fascinating story. And these are both, by the way, Republican appointed justices. Justice Powell tells a story that he was working as a lawyer at a Virginia firm when a young messenger boy, a young man, comes to him and says, "I need your help." He says, and this obviously is pre-Roe, "I just brought my girlfriend to an illegal abortion provider. She died, and now I am wanted as an accomplice to her death." And this horrible double tragedy so overwhelmed Justice Powell, as he told his clerks the next year, that he changed like that on the matter of abortion. He just said, this is not okay. So it shows that even stories, justices are human beings too. Like, it's very important. And I really believe that people need to think about how they can help to share stories. And the last thing to say, over and again, when I was writing my book, I came to see that there was a divide within the sort of pro-choice movement between the power centers in Washington and New York City, and a lot of times the sort of clinics on the front lines, far away from New Jersey. And I think it's very important, even if we're here in New Jersey, to think about how we can often help those states where abortion has just been overturned.
Thanks, Josh. Jackie, next steps.
Yeah, so obviously voting. I would say that our website, PP Action NJ, can help you do a couple of things. It can be a place where if you have a story to tell, there's a button to share your story with us. And we have a team of folks who will work with you to kind of help you be able to talk about it. For many people, even if they want to talk about it, it's hard and it's emotional. And so we can work with you and give you tips and tricks and pointers on how to talk about your story and how to do that. We are also really excited to announce, we just launched it yesterday. We're doing a series called Roe at 50. This January will mark the 50th anniversary of what would have been, Roe v. Wade. It is the first Roe without Roe. And so we have a series of fundraisers, rallies, different events that you can come out and get involved with all across the state, and did so very intentionally, because while there was a lot of groundswell with the Dobbs leak and then the Dobbs release, and we saw great turnouts for the election, we have to remember that this is a forever problem. And much as Josh just alluded to, here in New Jersey, things are in many ways better than in a lot of places. And so these events give us the opportunity to rally around the work that we need to do to expand access here, but also to hold time and hold space and create solidarity. And so again, PP Action NJ will show you all of those cool events that we're doing. And we hope to see many of the participants here tonight, guests who are joining us for this panel, come out in person and hang with us.
Thanks, Jackie. And Simone.
Well, I clearly have a bias to young people. And so, yes, to vote, I register all my patients to vote, all my kids' friends to vote. So just, I say engage young people in all areas of this conversation. I'm so excited to have heard about Uber Health, because a lot of those young people are driving for Uber and they do Uber Eats. And I can see a lot of them volunteering to do Uber Health as well, because they want to be engaged. So, I'd like to say to engage young people and talk. I'm a free flower. There's nothing that bothers me. I'm a full disclosure kind of gal. And I think the more people understand people's experiences and their histories, the more we can come together and understand each other and not be on this current divide that we're in. And we're like, oh no, you've got to be completely wrong and you've got to be completely wrong. To understand that there is really this middle, and we all are a lot more alike than we are different. And that's it. We all down inside are the same DNA, and that we all have to find that commonality.
I think that reminds me, and I guess my next step for folks would be to remember the intersectionality of things. The fact that, abortion justice and reproductive justice is inextricably intertwined with economic justice and racial justice and criminal justice, and all of the different ways in which injustice impacts all of us. So we need to remember that when we're talking about any one thing, we're talking about all of those things. And I encourage everybody to be an advocate for your conscience in each of those spaces. So with that, please join me in thanking our esteemed panelists, Kimberly Muttrison, Josh Prager, Jackie Cornell, and Simone Manigault, and thanking them for their expertise and their daily work. And with that, I want to say thank you to NJ PAC and the sponsors of tonight's event, and I'll turn it back to Donna Walker-Kuhn.
Thank you. My goodness, this is like a graduate level course in reproductive rights. I so appreciate all of your passion and of course, expertise, intelligence, and all navigating these difficult questions seamlessly and providing a space where we can talk about these things openly. Just so important. So thank you, thank you, thank you. And so for our audience, I just want to thank you as well for spending time with us. And to invite you to join us next month in January. Our Standing in Solidarity presentation will be Holocaust Remembrance Day, which is on January 23rd. And this panel, we're going to look at systemic racism, which is experienced by both Jewish people and African Americans, and how the arts enable us to fight back, and what does allyship look like? So that's going to be a really interesting conversation as well. In the meantime, have a wonderful holiday, everyone. Please smile, eat a lot, hold your stomach because you ate so much, and laugh and love. Thank you very much. Thank you.